space behind the armor simply makes the tank a larger target. In addition, the thin armor contributes to the vulnerability of the tank. A good picture illustrating this vulnerability is this slide. The tank on the left has a Soviet T-34. The pile of junk to the right rear is the remains of an M3 medium tank sent to the Russians on Lend-Lease. The largest surviving piece is the 75mm gun sponsor. The vertical volute spring suspension of the M2 medium tank was left virtually unchanged on the M3 medium tank. In function, as the road wheel was driven upward, the road wheel arm pivoted about this shaft. This in turn impinged to this friction bearing on the volute spring arm, which compressed the vertical volute spring until it bottomed out on its bumper. Disadvantages of this system were numerous. First, the relatively small road wheels contributed to heat buildup, so that as the tank moved over rough spots in the ground, the track was flexed around the road wheels, building up shear forces within the track. This decreased the reliability of the track. Lastly, if the rubber did separate from the road wheel, the entire road wheel shaft had to be pulled in order to change the road wheel. Road wheel arm travel was approximately 4 inches. This resulted in a fairly rough ride and negated the possibility of the installation of a progressive damping system. Progressive damping being a spring which increases its resistance as it is compressed, theoretically stopping motion prior to hitting the spring bumper. Such a system is, of course, highly desirable on a tank. This is the M4 medium tank, successor to the M3 medium tank. Basic hull layout of the M3 was retained to include the front drive. The M3 was replaced with horizontal volute spring suspension. In this system, each road wheel station is actually a dual road wheel station with the road wheel straddling the center guide. The road wheels themselves may be changed without the necessity of pulling a hub or a shaft. As the road wheel was driven upwards, the road wheel arm pivoted about this shaft, with other portions of the road wheel arm compressing 2 horizontal volute springs and this shock absorber. This system provided greater road wheel arm travel, more progressive damping, and a smoother ride than did the vertical volute spring system. Road wheels, however, were unevenly spaced, and this system shared the one great disadvantage of all systems wherein 2 or more road wheel stations are suspended from the same bogey station. This disadvantage is known as flyover or takeoff effect. It occurs at high speed where the tank is moving over uneven ground. As the ground falls away beneath the tank, an independently slung road wheel will have the tendency to go down to meet the ground. This either keeps the hull moving steady or at the very least cushions the impact. A non-independently slung road wheel will not go down to meet the ground. The tank will hurtle out into space over the lower ground, and when it passes the pivot point, it will come crashing downward. Let's go inside and take a look at the driver's compartment. From the loader's seat, you can see the bow gunner's position to the right of the transmission and the driver's seat to the left. The propeller shaft from the engine to the transmission runs underneath the turret basket. This leaves a space approximately 2 feet high from the turret basket floor down to the hull on either side of the propeller shaft. Ammunition was normally stowed in these spaces, and I'll have more to say about that a little bit later. Let's go up and take a look at the gunner's controls. One of the bright spots of the M4 was the turret. ring was 69 inches in diameter and allowed more than enough room for the loader to service the main gun. In addition, the tank could be upgunned with little problem. As a matter of fact, the Israelis have upgunned the M4 with the 105 millimeter gun of the AMX-30 tank. The gunner's controls were very advanced for the day. The gunner had a manual traversing and manual elevating hand wheel. He also had a power traversing handle, and there was an override for power traverse for the tank commander. The firing switches consisted of an electrical switch on the power traversing handle and 3 foot credits, 2 electric and 1 manual. The fire controls consisted of a periscope with a ballistic reticle, a telescope with a ballistic reticle, an auxiliary fire controls of an azimuth indicator, and a mounted elevation quadrant. In addition, the tank had a stabilization system. As I said, this was advanced for the day and put the United States approximately 20 years ahead of any other tank designing power. In contrast to the British, this system was simple, fast, and efficient. The British having an extremely complicated system. Contrasting with the Soviets, this system took full advantage of the accuracy potential of the main gun, whereas the Soviet system was so crude as to not take advantage of their potential. I've mentioned armor penetration and vulnerability, and I'd like to digress on this point for a moment, if I might. This chart shows the effectiveness of sloping armor to defeat penetration by an armor-penetrating projectile. Given a plate 100 millimeters thick, measured perpendicular to the face, and then sloping this plate backward at an angle increases the horizontal distance which the projectile must travel through the plate in order to penetrate the armored envelope. This is shown by the red curve. If this plate were sloped back at 60 degrees, entering the bottom axis at 60, going up to the actual curve and across, the thickness multiplier is 2, or 200 millimeters of armor, which the projectile must penetrate. The effective thickness of the resistance of this plate to penetration, however, is shown by the dotted line. Entering at 60 degrees and going over, we find 350 millimeters of effective resistance to penetration. This is so because when the projectile strikes the armored surface, there is a tendency for the nose of the projectile to shatter away, or for the projectile to be deflected upwards and ricochet above the target. There are 3 ways of combating this. One is to make the nose of the projectile of a very hard substance, this then striking the armor plate and having an effect called rose pedaling. It throws the armor up above the projectile in windrows or rose petals, and when these become high enough, the projectile will travel underneath them and penetrate the armored envelope. The other 2 ways are to simply make the projectile bigger or make it go faster. This slide shows the German tank rounds of World War II and illustrates their desire to make the projectile bigger and drive it faster. It starts with the 20 millimeter on the extreme left, goes up through the 88 millimeters, and ends with the 128 millimeter on the extreme right. One way of making a projectile go faster for any given bore size is to increase the cartridge case capacity, that is to put more powder behind the projectile. These 2 cartridges illustrate this. The one on the right is the 75 millimeter tank gun with which the United States started World War II. This one is the 76 millimeter tank gun with which we ended World War II, virtually the same bore size, yet a greatly increased cartridge case capacity. The effect of this is shown on this chart. This chart is for 30 caliber bore diameter. It holds true for any bore diameter. We picked 30 caliber because of the great amount of experimental data available. We express cartridge case capacity on the vertical axis in grains of 4831. This could be in grains of oatmeal or cubic centimeters. It does show that as the cartridge case capacity is increased, the potential velocity, as shown by this red line, also increases. For any given increase in powder, there is another given increase in velocity. Now, true, the law of diminishing returns will set in as this curve goes higher, but it always remains the greater the cartridge capacity, the greater the potential velocity. There is one problem associated with this, however, and that concerns the burning rate of the powder. This chart illustrates the burning rates of powder. The red curve shows a sample fast-burning powder, while the brown curve shows a sample slow-burning powder. The vertical axis shows pressure in thousands of pounds per square inch. Notice that the fast-burning powder achieves its maximum amplitude at 55,000 pounds per square inch and then drops off rapidly. Now, this ceiling of 55,000 pounds per square inch is the current limit. With the metallurgical technology at the state of the art today, the highest pressure that can be reliably and safely used within the gun tube is 55,000 pounds per square inch. Yet this fast-burning powder, as it falls off, is very, very dense. It will not fill the large capacity cartridge case. Further, the bore need be no longer than approximately here, for at this point, the greater area of the curve, which is directly translatable as energy delivered to the projectile, has already occurred. So the slower burning powders, which are far bulkier and therefore will fill the greater capacity cartridge cases, have to be used. The maximum amplitude, also 55,000 pounds per square inch, occurs with these powders farther down the barrel. Yet the fall off of the curve is much, much slower. So with a longer barrel, say approximately here, the total area under the curve for the slow-burning powder is far greater than the total area under the curve for the fast-burning powder. Therefore, the velocity is higher. The Germans tried another means of taking advantage of the slow-burning powder in the larger capacity cartridge cases. And this was the Gerlach taper bore system. In this system, the projectile, in this case a 75 millimeter, started out as its full diameter at the breech end. But as it proceeded up the bore was conical in section and squeezed the skirts back onto the body of the projectile. The projectile exited the muzzle, in this case, as 55 millimeters. This meant that the swept volume of the bore, that is, the volume of the bore as the projectile traveled up it, remained in a different ratio to the cartridge case capacity. In effect, it kept the downward portion of the slow-burning powder curve artificially high. This slide shows the Gerlach projectile in cross-section. You can see the skirts, which are squeezed back on the projectile body, and the tungsten carbide core. Using this system, the Germans got muzzle velocities on the order of 4,600 feet per second, which for a two-wheeled anti-tank gun in World War II isn't bad. Assuming that one does not go to the trouble of a tapered bore, there is another means of taking advantage of the increased cartridge case capacity and increasing the muzzle velocity of the projectile. The normal shot round is constructed like this 120 millimeter US shot round with a full bore, that is 120 millimeter in diameter, armor penetrator. The Germans had a projectile called the Arrowhead, shown here on this slide, which shows a smaller than full bore diameter armor penetrator with skirts much like the Gerlach taper bore. These skirts were not crushed back upon the projectile body as the projectile exited the muzzle. The Americans had an equivalent called the HIVAP, or high velocity armor penetrator. Windscreen came off, the aluminum inner cap came off, and you have a tungsten carbide penetrator. There's a disadvantage, however, to this high-velocity armor-penetrating projectile, and that concerns the ballistic properties of the projectile, the sectional density, and the ballistic coefficient. The sectional density is a number which expresses the ratio of the weight of this projectile to its cross-sectional area. The greater the weight against the area, the greater the sectional density number, the greater the projectile's ability to penetrate either air or armor or whatever. In the high-velocity armor-piercing projectile, there was a great deal of space and aluminum around the armor penetrator. So for the armor to be penetrated, the sectional density of the penetrator itself was quite high. As far as the air was concerned, with the entire projectile windscreen mounted on the front, and it did not separate until contact with the target, the sectional density of the projectile was very low. There is one other ballistic property, and this is the ballistic coefficient. Ballistic coefficient is simply the sectional density of the projectile multiplied by a form factor, or coefficient of form. The ballistic coefficient for the high-velocity armor-piercing projectile, despite its good aerodynamic shape, was relatively poor. This chart illustrates the effect of ballistic coefficient on remaining velocity. The vertical axis shows ballistic coefficient. The horizontal axis shows remaining velocity in hundreds of feet per second at 500 yards, given a muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet per second. So a projectile with a ballistic coefficient of 0.220 fired at 3,000 feet per second is going 1,300 feet per second at 500 yards. A projectile with a ballistic coefficient of 0.610 fired at 3,000 feet per second is traveling at 2,300 feet per second at 500 yards. I might add that the difference between these two projectiles is not weight or diameter, but in this case is the aerodynamic form factor alone. The effect of ballistic coefficient for a tanker was rather important. This chart shows the armor penetration curves for APCR, the same as arrowhead or high VAP, and APC-BC, the same as the shot round. Note that due to its greater muzzle velocity, the arrowhead round can penetrate in excess of 12 inches of armor at the muzzle. But as it proceeds downrange, this curve falls off more rapidly than for the shot round due to the arrowhead round's poor ballistic coefficient. This particular chart is for the German 88mm L71 gun, and these curves will cross at approximately 3,000 meters. For the American 76mm round, the difference in weight and velocity of the projectiles was far greater, and the two curves crossed at approximately 1,100 meters. This, however, didn't make much difference to an American tanker because the 76mm gun wouldn't penetrate much past 1,100 meters anyway. This chart shows the effect of ballistic coefficient for an American tanker today. The horizontal axis shows range expressed in thousands of meters. The vertical axis shows remaining velocity expressed as a percentage of muzzle velocity. The M728 sabot round, shown by the brown line, has the highest retained velocity at 4,000 meters. This is due to its 4 diameter shot round, while the yellow lines show the muzzle velocity attained with the high VAP or arrowhead rounds. Note, with the exception of the German 88mm L71 and 75mm L70 tank cannon, which are extremes in large case capacity and long bores, that there is a plateau of approximately 3,000 feet per second with full bore diameter shot rounds. Now, if you'll indulge me for just one more chart, let's take a look at the Russian and British tank cannon. Once again, with the British and Russian tank cannon, you can see a plateau of approximately 3,000 feet per second for the full bore diameter shot rounds. The yellow line again represents the high VAP or arrowhead, or in the case of some weapons, the sabot round. Notice with the sabot round, there appears to be a plateau of approximately 5,000 feet per second maximum muzzle velocity. This velocity plateau of 5,000 feet per second is very real and results from the burning rate of the slower burning powders. It will not be broken save for one of 3 things happening. First is a breakthrough in metallurgical technology allowing tank cannon to safely operate at pressures higher than 55,000 pounds per square inch, say on the order of 70,000 pounds per square inch. Second is the use of current-sized armor penetrators, but with larger sabots, say water and wet stowage of the ammunition. In this, the honeycomb is mounted within a box, such that the ammunition is all within the profile of the box. The box is filled with glycerin, and should an armor penetrator go through the ammunition, it also pulls the glycerin behind it, thereby extinguishing any fires. This was quite successful and could be used today on the ammunition honeycomb in the bustle of the M60A1 and A3 tanks. The other method was the use of applique armor. This was armor made in the factories in the United States and sent overseas. It was pre-shaped for designated weak spots on the hull, could be placed on the external surfaces of the hull, and tack welded around the edges. This method was less than successful. As you can see on this slide, there's a Sherman tank with applique armor on the front of the hull, the side of the hull, and the front of the turret. Unfortunately, it didn't do this fellow much good. This is a Soviet T-34 tank, originally designed for the 76 millimeter gun, and in this model upgunned to the 85 millimeter gun. When first designed, the Soviets desired to maximize protection, so they sloped the armor on the flanks, the rear, and the forward glacis plate. When they upgunned to the 85 millimeter gun, they had to extend the turret ring to the maximum width of the top deck and as far forward as possible on the glacis plate. They still did not have enough room, so they extended the turret nose and mounted the gun trunnions in the nose forward of the turret ring. This gave the loader enough room to load the main gun. In order to counterbalance this weight, they then built an extended bustle on the rear of the turret. Before we drop inside, I'd like to show you one thing on the suspension. The Soviets copied the Christie suspension almost exactly. From the outside, the only thing visible is this road wheel arm hub. The road wheel arm comes up to this hub and is joined here to a shaft which goes through the hull of the tank to the interior. It is held against axial thrust by this plate. We'll see more of this suspension when we go inside. From the loader's position, you can see into the compartment for the driver and the bow gunner. This shaft is the interior portion of the road wheel arm shaft which you saw earlier. It has a bell crank behind which impinges on this spring mounted in the spring tower. Looking across the hull, you can see another spring tower and still another along the hull. Each road wheel in the Christie suspension was independently sloped. In addition, the tall spring towers allowed the installation of a progressive damping system. The disadvantage to this system was that it took up a great deal of space on the inside of the hull. The British also used the Christie suspension system. This slide of the Cromwell tank shows the road wheels on the exterior portion. The spring towers on the inside restricted space for the crew, and though the turret ring could be extended out to the limits of the hull, the crew was very cramped. This tank also had applique armor, and as you can see, it didn't do them very much good either. In 1935, the British designed their Centurion tank. Unlike their previous tanks, they desired to maximize armor protection and firepower. The resulting 4.5-inch armor basis of the Centurion makes it, even today, one of the best protected tanks of the Western world. The hull was designed to accommodate a turret ring so large that later models of the tank were easily upgunned to the 105 millimeter gun. With the Centurion's low horsepower to weight ratio and resulting low speed, the British were not worried about takeoff or flyover effect. They did, however, want progressive damping in order to... And Tiger and late models of the Yaga Tiger, which you see here. This suspension system consisted of 8 road wheels to the side, being mounted 2 each at 4 bogie stations. The torsion bars were mounted parallel to the long axis of the tank, and the torsion bars themselves only springing the 2 wheels of each bogie station. The Henschel suspension was mounted on all other tanks. This has the torsion bar running underneath the belly of the tank, and the road wheels, in order to get 8 road wheel stations per side, were interleaved. This system was used on the Tiger, which you see here, and on the Panther tank. As you look at the interleaving road wheels, you see what looks to be an inboard and an outboard road wheel station. What is the inboard station to the viewer is actually a middle station. The outboard station consists of a dual road wheel, one on the inside and one on the outside. The advantages to this, it has larger road wheels, and there are 8 road wheel stations to the side. The obvious disadvantage is that mud builds up between the middle and the inboard road wheel. When stopping at night, the mud freezes, it cannot be chipped out, and it immobilizes the tank. As a result, the Germans on the King Tiger II, which you see on the right here, went to an overlapping suspension, and I will cover that in a few moments. At the same time, in late 1944, the Germans made the decision to go to a family of 3 tanks, a light, a medium, and a heavy. The light would be based on the Panther, the 50-ton tank you see on the left. The medium would be based on the Tiger II, the 65-ton tank on the right, and the heavy would be the Mouse tank, weighing in excess of 100 tons. The suspension components between these tanks were to be common. The guns, turret systems, engines, and transmissions were also to be common. The Panther, in prototype versions, was fitted with the overlapping suspension of the King Tiger II and the transmission of the King Tiger II. Turrets were to be fitted, which mounted 88mm guns. However, the war ended before the Germans could get to this point in testing. The Panther tank in the collection of the Patton Museum is one of these experimental Panthers, a Panther 1.5. You can see the overlapping torsion bar suspension borrowed from the King Tiger II. There are 7 road wheel stations to the side, alternating outboard and inboard. Each road wheel station is actually a dual wheel installation, and the track has 2 rows of center guides for the outboard and the inboard stations. Before we can go further on the Panther, there are 2 other decisions which we must cover. From 1940 onwards, the Germans desired to increase the armor protection of their tanks. At first, they tried applique armor, as you can see on this slide of a Mark III turret and this slide of a Mark III hull. The armor on the Mark IV tank was made thicker, and the armor on the Tiger was made thicker still. However, the Germans retained the vertical box-like superstructure which Hitler thought was the Germanic look. By late 1942, they had learned some lessons from the Russian T-34. One of these concerned sloped armor. The Germans decided to produce a tank, the Panther, with sloped armor. You can see the heavily sloped bow plates and the sloped flank plates. This was one decision which the Germans would not compromise. The other decision which the Germans would not compromise in any way concerned the transmission and steering units. And on this point, I would like to digress for just a moment. There are 2 major families of transmission and steering units, the brake differential and the clutch and brake. In the brake differential, there is an input shaft running into a differential much like on the common United States automobile. From this, 2 output shafts are mounted perpendicular to the input shaft. When the driver desired to steer to one side or the other, he would pull the track brake on the inboard side. This would slow down or stop the inboard output shaft, with power continuing to be delivered to the outboard output shaft. The tank would thereby make the turn. This differential system has a disadvantage in that power on the inboard side is lost through the track brake. Addition of some extra gears makes the transmission a controlled differential transmission, which is regenerative. In this, as the driver pulls the brake on the inboard side, the power from the inboard side is applied as an addition to the outboard side, and the tank makes a faster turn. This transmission and steer unit was used on all U.S. tanks in World War II and is currently used on the M113 family of vehicles. I might add that the water steer unit on the M113 is nothing more than an additional brake differential steering system added as an overdrive. Addition of another differential to the brake differential transmission created the double differential transmission. This was also regenerative and gave the driver the advantage of infinite turning radii. An epicyclic equivalent of this necessitated the incorporation of this large access plate over top of the driver's and the bow gunner's position in order to install and service the transmission. Of course, there was another access plate in the rear for the installation and servicing of the engine. These two access plates, plus the sloped flank armor, restricted the size of the turret ring and moved the turret to the center of the tank. In order to get adequate penetration on enemy armored vehicles, the Germans needed a high-velocity cannon. Yet the size of the turret ring restricted the size of the ammunition. Therefore, they designed and installed the extremely long-barreled 75mm L70 gun. This gun fired full-bore size shot projectiles at 3,100 feet per second. As with other tanks, the gun trunnions of the Panther were moved forward of the turret ring so that the loader would have enough room to serve the main gun. Despite the need to counterbalance this turret, the desire for increased protection prohibited the incorporation of a turret bustle to the rear of the turret. The gun itself was counterbalanced on the trunnions by large weights bolted to the breech. The traversing and elevating mechanisms were heavily geared so that the gunner could freely move the turret and the gun. By late 1944, the 75mm gun of the Panther was approaching the point of inadequacy, and the Germans had seen the other errors in the Panther's design. Plans for the Panther II called for incorporation of the Tiger II's transmission, reduction in size or elimination of the forward access plate, and a larger turret ring, turret, and gun. In the past